In 1995, the FDA approved a label that would kill 500,000 Americans. This is how it happened. To understand that moment, to understand how a government agency signed the death warrant for a generation, you have to go back. If you go back and look at the history of modern advertising, if you look at the way products were sold in America in the middle of the 20th century, you eventually run into a man named Arthur Sackler. And Arthur Sackler was a genius. There is no other way to put it. He was a psychiatrist, he was a marketer, and he understood something about the American medical establishment that nobody else quite understood at the time. He understood that if you wanted to sell a pill, you did not market it to the patient. You marketed it to the doctor. You seduced the doctor. You put the doctor in a glossy magazine. You invited the doctor to a steak dinner. You made the doctor feel like a scientist and a savior all at once. Arthur Sackler is the one who revolutionized medical advertising. Before him, drug companies sold medicine the way you sell machine parts. Dry, factual, boring. Sackler made it aggressive. He made it scientific sounding. And he made it incredibly lucrative. He was the man behind the marketing of Valium. He was the man behind the marketing of Librium. He founded a publication called the Medical Tribune, which looked like a serious medical newspaper, but was essentially a marketing vehicle to reach 600,000 doctors. He turned anxiety into a business model. He built a fortune. He built an empire. And when he died in 1987, he left that empire to his brothers and his children. And one of the jewels in that empire was a small, relatively obscure company called Purdue Pharma. Now, keep that name in your head, Purdue Pharma. Because in the early 1990s, Purdue Pharma had a serious problem. Their patent was running out on a cancer pain drug called OxyContin. OxyContin was a good earner for them, but the patent clock was ticking, and when the patent runs out, the generics come in, the competition floods the market, and the profit margin evaporates. That is how the drug business works. It is a cliff, and Purdue was staring over the edge of that cliff. So the family, the Sacklers, and the executives at Purdue, they needed a sequel. They needed a blockbuster. They needed something that would replace that revenue stream, and not just replace it, but supercharge it. They needed a drug that could be sold not just for the dying, not just for end of life cancer care, but for everything, for the back itch, for the sports injury, for the wisdom tooth extraction, for the chronic pain that affects millions and millions of Americans. And what they came up with was OxyContin. Now, technically, chemically, OxyContin was not a new invention. It is oxycodone. Oxycodone had been around since Germany in 1916. It is a semi-synthetic opioid. It is a cousin of heroin. It is twice as powerful as morphine. Everyone in medicine knew what oxycodone was. They knew it was effective for pain. They also knew it was highly addictive. It was a nuclear weapon in the war on pain. You used it for the worst kinds of trauma. You did not use it for a sore knee. But Purdue had an idea. They had a delivery system. They had a patented time-release coating. The idea was that you take a huge dose of oxycodone, a dose that would normally knock a horse over, and you wrap it in this time-release shell so that the drug dissolves slowly over 12 hours. And their theory, the story they decided to tell the FDA and the American public, was that because the drug was released slowly, it would not cause that euphoric high that leads to addiction. They said the time-release mechanism was a shield against abuse. They said it smoothed out the peaks and valleys of the blood serum levels. This was the pitch. And it was a brilliant pitch. But there was a problem. It was not true. It simply was not true. And the documents we have now, the internal emails, the memos that have come out through years and years of litigation, they show that Purdue knew it was not true. They knew that if you crushed the pill, you broke the time-release mechanism. You could snort it. You could inject it. You could get the full payload of narcotic all at once. They knew this. But they went to the FDA anyway. And this is where the story gets really dark. This is where the institutions that are supposed to protect us failed. In 1995, the FDA approved OxyContin. And not only did they approve it, they allowed Purdue to put a sentence on the label that is arguably one of the most destructive sentences in the history of American medicine. The label said that the delayed absorption of the drug was believed to reduce the liability of abuse. believed to reduce. Not proven. Believed. That one sentence became the golden ticket. It was the license to print money. Because armed with that label, Purdue Pharma launched what was essentially a military-style invasion of the American medical system. They did not just put out a few ads. They built an army. They hired hundreds of sales reps, young, attractive, driven salespeople. They recruited them from the cheerleading squads and the sports teams of big universities. They trained them to be aggressive, and they armed them with data. Purdue was one of the first companies to really master the art of data mining in medicine. They bought prescriber profiles. They knew exactly which doctors in which counties were prescribing the most painkillers. They knew who the high-volume prescribers were, and they targeted those doctors with laser precision. They targeted general practitioners. They targeted family doctors in rural areas. Doctors who did not know a lot about complex pain management, but who had a waiting room full of coal miners with bad backs and factory workers with repetitive stress injuries. They told these doctors that OxyContin was safe. They said it was non-addictive. They said, and this is a quote, less than 1% of patients would get addicted. Less than 1%. Now, where did they get that number? Did they do a massive clinical trial? Did they study thousands of people over 10 years? No. They got it from a 5-sentence letter to the editor published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980. A letter called the Porter and Jick letter. And that letter was not even about long-term opioid use at home. It was about hospitalized patients being monitored by nurses in a controlled environment. But Purdue took that letter, they weaponized it, they blew it up into glossy charts and graphs, and they told doctors across this country that the science was settled. They said addiction was a myth. They said the real tragedy was that people were suffering in silence because doctors were too afraid to prescribe the good stuff. And it worked. My God, did it work? Sales went from $48 million in 1990, to $1.1 billion in 2000. Just 4 years later, $1.1 billion. They were giving out plush toys. They were giving out fishing hats. They were giving out clocks and pedometers with the OxyContin logo on them. They were flying doctors to resorts in Florida and Arizona for pain management conferences, which were really just all expenses, paid vacations where Purdue reps and paid consultants told them prescribe more and prescribe higher doses. They created a bonus system for their sales reps that was absolutely unconscionable. If you got a doctor in West Virginia to write more prescriptions for the 80-milligram pills, the strongest ones, the ones street users eventually called OxyContins, you got a bigger bonus. You could make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just by pushing this one drug. The internal emails show sales managers writing their teams, telling them to target the whales, the doctors who were writing scripts as fast as they could sign their names. There was a concept they pushed called pseudo-addiction. You have to appreciate the darkness of this. They told doctors that if a patient was acting like an addict, if they were begging for more pills, if they were aggressive, if they were drug seeking, if they were crushing the pills, that wasn't addiction. No, that was pseudo-addiction. And the cure for pseudo-addiction, according to the literature Purdue distributed, was more opioids. They said the patient was just in pain, and the pain was making them act crazy, so you needed to up the dose. It is almost impossible to wrap your head around that level of gaslighting. You have a house on fire, and the company selling you the gasoline tells you that the best way to put out the fire is to pour more gasoline on it. And if the fire gets bigger, pour more gasoline. And while the money was pouring into Purdue's headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, while the Sackler family was becoming one of the richest families in America, wealthier than the Rockefellers, something else was happening in the rest of the country. It started in the coal fields. It started in Appalachia, in Maine, in Ohio, in rural Virginia. Doctors started noticing that patients were coming back earlier and earlier for refills. They were noticing that people were losing their jobs. They were noticing that the pills were being sold in high school parking lots. The crime rate started to spike. Pharmacies were being robbed. Not for cash. They were stepping over the cash. They wanted the OxyContin. It became a currency. It was dollar for dollar more valuable than gold in some of these communities. You could pay your rent with it. You could buy a car with it. There was a town in West Virginia called Williamson. Population 3,000, roughly. In a span of 10 years, drug companies shipped 20 million pain pills to 2 pharmacies in that town. 20 million pills for 3,000 people. You do the math. Every man, woman, and child in that town could have been swallowing pills for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they still wouldn't have run out. And Purdue, what did Purdue do when the reports started coming in? Did they say, "Oh my goodness, we made a mistake"? Did they recall the drug? Did they issue warnings? No, they blamed the patients. They called them abusers. They said the problem wasn't the drug. The problem was the people taking it. They sent memos discussing how they could spin the narrative to make it look like a law enforcement issue, not a public health issue. By the early 2000s, it was a catastrophe. It was a plague. The stories coming out of places like Painkiller, Kentucky, and Huntington, West Virginia, were like something out of a horror movie. Entire families addicted. Grandmothers raising grandchildren because the parents were dead or in jail. Foster care systems overwhelmed. Morgues running out of space. And the federal government finally started to wake up. It took too long, but they started to wake up. In 2007, there was a moment where it looked like there might be justice. The Justice Department, the prosecutors in Virginia, they went after Purdue. They had the evidence. They had the internal memos where executives admitted they knew the pills were being crushed and snorted. They had the marketing plans. They had the proof that the marketing was fraudulent. But look at what happened. Purdue hired the best lawyers money could buy. They hired Rudy Giuliani. They leveraged their connections. And they cut a deal. In 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to a felony. They paid a $600 million fine, and 3 executives pleaded guilty to misdemeanors. They did community service. Nobody went to jail. The Sacklers, the family that owned the company, the family that sat on the board, the family that micromanaged the sales reports and asked why sales were down in specific territories, they were not charged. Their name was not even on the paperwork. And critically, the company did not lose its license to sell the drug. They kept selling it. In fact, they sold more of it. After pleading guilty to lying about the drug's safety in 2007, Purdue continued to rake in billions of dollars for another decade. They took that $600 million fine, which sounds like a lot of money to you and me, but to them, it was a speeding ticket. It was a rounding error. It was the cost of doing business. They wrote the check, and they went right back to work. But the crisis was evolving. As the death toll mounted, the government started cracking down on the pill mills, the shady pain clinics where you could walk in with cash and walk out with a script for 90 pills. They started tracking prescriptions. The supply of pills started to tighten up. And this is the second act of the tragedy. Because by 2010, Purdue reformulated the drug. They made it harder to crush. They finally did what they said they had done in the beginning. They made it abuse deterrent, and they patted themselves on the back for it. But what happens when you take a population of millions of people who are physically dependent on a drug, people whose brain chemistry has been rewritten by high-dose opioids, and you suddenly cut off their supply? What happens when the pills become too expensive or too hard to crush? They do not just stop. They cannot stop. The sickness of withdrawal is too great. So they turn to the cheaper alternative. They turn to the black market. They turn to heroin. We saw a massive shift. People who started with a legal prescription from a board-certified physician ended up with a needle in their arm. And then the drug cartels, seeing this massive new market of customers, started mixing fentanyl into the heroin. Fentanyl, which is 50 times stronger than heroin. And the death toll went vertical. We are talking about life expectancy in the United States actually dropping for the first time in decades. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of Americans dead. We are talking about a generation of lost potential. And all the while this carnage was unfolding, the money was being siphoned out of Purdue Pharma. This is the part that makes you want to scream. As the lawsuits started to pile up again, as the states started to sue, as the cities started to sue, The Sackler family started taking money off the table. Billions of dollars, wire transfers, dividend payments. Money moved from Purdue Pharma into the private trusts and offshore accounts of the family members. They knew the ship was sinking. They knew the reckoning was eventually going to arrive. So they stripped the cupboards bare. They hollowed out the company so that when the plaintiffs finally got there, when the victims finally got to the vault, it would be empty. So when we get to the bankruptcy, when we get to the big settlement talks that we have been watching for the last few years, Purdue Pharma cries poverty. They say, we don't have that much money left. And this brings us to the legal concept that you need to understand. It is called a non-consensual third-party release. It is a piece of bankruptcy law magic. The Sackler family did not file for bankruptcy. They are fine. They are wealthy. Only the company Purdue filed for bankruptcy. But the Sacklers proposed a deal. They said, we will contribute some money to the settlement. We will pay roughly $6 billion over a period of years. But in exchange, you have to grant us total immunity. Immunity, a legal shield that says nobody can sue them ever again for this. Not the states, not the cities, not the tribes, not the hospitals, and most importantly, not the families who lost their children. $6 billion. It sounds like a massive number. It is a massive number, but you have to look at the balance sheet. They made much more than that. Estimates are that the family fortune is worth significantly more. They get to keep the rest. They get to stay rich. They get to keep their art collections and their mansions in London and their chalets in Gstaad. They get to keep their names on the museums. Well, some of the museums are taking the names down now, but the money is still there. They admit to no wrongdoing. They offer no apology. They just write a check and they walk away. This is the $35 billion lie. It wasn't just a lie about a pill coating. It was a lie about safety. It was a lie about science. It was a lie about patient care. And ultimately, it was a lie about justice. Because the premise of our system is supposed to be that if you commit a crime, if you kill people, if you defraud the public, you pay the price. If you or I sold a product that killed 1,000 people, we would be in prison. We would not be negotiating a settlement from a yacht. But the lesson of Purdue Pharma, the lesson that is written on the tombstones of 500,000 Americans, is that if you steal enough money, if you kill enough people, and if you hire enough lawyers, the rules do not apply to you. You can buy your way out. You can turn back pain into a death sentence for your customers and turn it into a multi-billion-dollar fortune for yourself. And the system will let you do it. Think about the regulators. The FDA official, Dr. Curtis Wright, who oversaw the approval of OxyContin. He is the one who approved that label. He is the one who signed off on the believed to reduce abuse language. A year after he left the FDA, he took a job at Purdue Pharma with a starting package of nearly $400,000 a year. The revolving door, it spins and spins. Think about the absurdity of the Project Tango documents. These were internal documents at Purdue where they discussed expanding into the addiction treatment business. They mapped it out. They looked at the charts. They saw that as opioid prescriptions went up, addiction went up, and they saw a business opportunity. They could sell the pills that caused the addiction, and then they could sell the drugs to treat the addiction. They were going to monetize the entire life cycle of the tragedy they created. They didn't go through with it. But the fact that they put it on a whiteboard, the fact that they had meetings about it, tells you everything you need to know about the soul of this enterprise. And now we are at a crossroads. The bankruptcy settlement has been fought over, appealed, overturned, and appealed again. The Supreme Court is looking at it. The question is whether we allow this kind of loophole. Do we allow billionaires to hijack the bankruptcy courts to get immunity for crimes they didn't even file bankruptcy for? If this deal goes through as it was designed, it changes the nature of American justice. It says that justice is a commodity. It says that if you are rich enough, you can purchase a get out of jail free card. And what about the victims? What about the mothers who found their sons cold in their bedrooms? What about the babies born in withdrawal, shaking and screaming in the NICU? The settlement money is supposed to go to abatement. It is supposed to go to treatment centers and Narcan and education. And that is good, that is necessary, but it does not bring anyone back. And it does not hold the architects of this crisis accountable in the way that actually matters. They wanted to be known as philanthropists, the Sacklers. They wanted their name on the wing of the Met. They wanted their name on the Sackler Gallery in London. They wanted to be the American medicists. And for a long time, they bought their way into polite society with the proceeds of this drug. But now that name is stained. It is synonymous with greed. It is synonymous with the opioid crisis. But shame is not justice. Shame does not put you in a cell. Shame does not confiscate the billions of dollars sitting in trust funds in Jersey and the Caribbean. The story of Purdue Pharma is the story of modern America. It is a story of regulatory capture. It is a story of the corruption of science. It is a story of how the pursuit of profit was placed above the value of human life, not by accident, but by design. It is easy to look at the street dealer and say he is the bad guy. It is easy to look at the addict and say he made a bad choice. It is much harder and much more important to look at the boardroom, to look at the people in the bespoke suits who never touched a pill, who never saw a patient, but who looked at a spreadsheet and decided that the deaths were an acceptable side effect of the revenue growth. They turned the medical system against the American people. They took the trust that we have in doctors, that sacred trust that says, if my doctor gives me this, it must be okay. And they exploited it for cash. They stripped-mined our communities. And the anger you feel when you hear this story, that anger is the appropriate reaction. You should be angry. You should be furious, because it is not over. The pills are still out there. The addiction is still out there. And the precedent that this case sets, that you can settle your way out of mass casualty events, is a danger to all of us. So do not look away. Watch what happens in the courts. Watch where the money goes. And remember the names. Not just the name of the drug, but the name of the family that pushed it. And if you think this playbook died with Purdue, if you think this was a one-off, you are mistaken. There is another company, a company called Insys. They took the Purdue playbook and they turned the volume up to 11. If you want to see how the sequel played out and how they bribed doctors with lap dances and gun range trips, click the video on your screen right now. You need to know that story too.